2023 was the warmest year on record as extreme heat and climate disasters continue to rise. Some legal and scientific experts are now joining forces to pursue a new tactic, charging polluters with homicide. The Lever's senior investigative reporter, Lois Parshley, published a piece titled "Taking the Climate Killers to Court" and joins us now to discuss. Thank you so much, Lois, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm fascinated by this because, it's clearly not happening legislatively anytime soon. And the climate community, organizers, scientists have been raising alarms for decades about climate change. But why did it take so long to pursue some of these companies this way legally? I know that there have been lawsuits against oil companies in the past, but this seems like a very creative tactic. But is it too late?
That's a great question. And you're right, there have been civil lawsuits against fossil fuel companies in the past, but this is a new step in the effort to hold oil companies accountable for their emissions. I spoke to scientists who are behind some of the attribution research, which is helping show how emissions are causing these kinds of catastrophes, and that ability to directly pinpoint just how much emissions are contributing to a given event is one of the things that's helping enable these kinds of new litigation strategies.
So to me, frankly, this sounds nuts to say that people should be charged with homicide or accused of homicide over emissions levels. Every single person, obviously, in the country emits some level of emissions. There's a higher level for some corporations, but how are we going to draw the through line exactly from one person's death, for example, to, well, this company released the emissions at this amount in this location and therefore they're responsible? I mean, just even from a logistical standpoint, how exactly is this going to work?
It's a reasonable question, and I think one that juries will have as well. It might help to share the story of one of the families that I spoke to. I think sometimes when we talk about these things in the abstract, it's easy to get lost in statistics. But I spoke to a woman named Eliza who lives in Montreal. She had just given birth in the fall of 2020 when she got a panicked call from her brother. A storm was approaching their mother's house in southwest France, and he hadn't been able to reach their mother. All communications to this valley had been cut off. Hundreds of people were being evacuated, and neither one of them could get any official information about whether or not their mom had made it out of this flash flood. Eliza got online. She saw the social media posts of houses being swept off their foundations and got more and more worried. Her brother actually hiked up over a mountain past where the road was closed in order to try to get into the village to find out what had happened. And he eventually talked to a rescue team who told them that by the time they tried to evacuate the part of the valley where their mother lived, it was too late. Their mom was only 67 days old, and the only reason her body was found was a neighbor happened to notice wolves in the yard behind his house. Now, you might wonder how climate change is connected to this. Researchers after this storm showed that events like this are getting far more likely due to climate change. That's one type of attribution research. Others are showing exactly how much emissions contribute to things like hurricanes. It is now, surprisingly, if you haven't been following the science, very easy to say just how much emissions cause any given event. In fact, today, about half the country is suffering under excessive heat, and scientists have told us that event itself is 3 times more likely due to climate change.
And if I may follow up, we also know that these storms are getting less deadly in part due to the technology that's been made available because of fossil fuel use. So how do you offset the potential that scientists say that fossil fuel use is increasing the frequency of storms, but at the same time we know the severity has been lessened in terms of the death toll?
I think it very much depends on who you ask whether the severity is lessened. In fact, a warmer atmosphere holds more precipitation, which tends to make things like hurricanes more severe. If you're referring to adaptation, which is how we prepare for storms, that's something that we're all going to have to do more of. And that costs money, which is one of the reasons people are advocating for these kinds of lawsuits. Coming back to your earlier question, one of the most important things with these cases will be to establish the causal chain between the fossil fuel company's conduct and climate-related deaths. So that means you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that a company's emissions contributed to climate change, which is pretty easy, that those emissions caused or contributed to a climate-related disaster, and that someone died as a result. It also matters that these companies knew that their behavior was harmful all the way back into the 1960s.
There are some cases in the past, I think notably would be Stephen Donziger, who successfully was able to challenge Chevron in a case, that took him 30 years to accomplish, but he was prosecuted and he was punished for taking on a big fossil fuel company. Are there concerns that taking on fossil fuel companies are going to put the legal community at risk, the activists at risk, as has happened in previous situations?
I think that's always a valid question. One of the things that legal advocates shared with me when I asked that question was that they are hoping to establish bellwether cases, which the very process, whether or not they win these cases, in the process of discovery, interesting documents may emerge from the companies themselves. In the case of big tobacco cases in the 1990s, the discovery process helped reveal really damaging for public opinion information, which seemed to swing the tide of public opinion and led to really large settlements.
Question over strategy. How do they choose where to file these lawsuits? Because we know how conservative the courts are across the country, how many judicial picks under the Trump administration were pushed forward. Is this impacting their decision on which cases to take and where to try them?
That is a great question, and I should be very clear. So far, none of these criminal homicide cases have been filed in the US. The first such case, an involuntary manslaughter case, was filed this spring in France. But I have spoken to experts who are advocating for similar trials to be filed here. Defense attorneys from Texas to Oregon have been speaking to the nonprofit Public Citizen, which has been advocating for trials along these lines.
And what is the status of the case in France?
The case was filed this May. It is working its way through the French court system, which is a little bit different than ours.
Do you see a pathway in Europe being a little bit more likely than the United States? Are the systems, obviously the court system, each country is different and the politics are different, but because of Europe's role in taking on climate change a little bit more seriously than, let's say, our country, do you see that there might be a better pathway?
Well, it will definitely be interesting to watch it play out. That might influence the odds of such a case being filed in the US. The court systems themselves and how the process unfolds is different enough that the step-by-step process looks quite different. But one of the things that, again, might emerge was this French case is documentation that helps provide fuel for lawyers who might be interested in pursuing a similar case in the United States. Certainly, it gives the oil companies an opportunity to make their defense. They obviously disagree that they should be held responsible for climate homicides. So it will be a first opportunity for everyone to hear the kind of arguments that come up.
Clearly it's a very interesting way of profiling these stories too, and releasing more information about the companies that you wouldn't have access to. As you mentioned, just the knowledge that so many of these oil companies have in what they're doing to the environment. Obviously, we all know this at this point, but the details about that does not make a great case for them publicity-wise.
Publicity is definitely part of the picture. That has been the case for many different kinds of lawsuits, whether you're talking about big tobacco or the opioid settlements in the more recent past. And it's also an important opportunity here to ask questions and look for documentation about things that show the oil company's intention, which is a legal concept called mens rea. It's the idea that how you intended to act also matters in terms of the gravitude of your crime.
All right, Lois, thank you so much for joining us today on Rising. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.